What's up, everybody? Happy Saturday. Happy Saturday. I am live. Please come on in and say hello. I am Sonja, host of The Legal Score. And shout out to Brian B.A. Strilla on the ones and twos, Pink Fanfur. I have an amazing promo team. And thank you all, my YouTube subscribers, those who are watching live. Please say hello, say good afternoon. Let me know where you're watching from and share this live. Now, on my Saturday segment for my new viewers, this is where I'm delving into some law. And today, law absolutely is going to intersect with my love of sports as well. I am talking about none other than the Poison Playbook trial. Let me get my graphics up here for you guys so you'll know this is going to be the Blaze Taylor, State of Tennessee versus Blaze Taylor. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys. I didn't know about this trial or this offense or anything until several weeks ago. And I watched this trial day by day, all 8 days of it until the verdict came in. And we're going to walk through that today. I'm going to break down some background on things that have gone on for those who do not know about who Blaze Taylor is. But this is a show you're not going to want to miss. So make sure you come on in and say hello. We will be here for an hour, and it is 4 p.m. on the East Coast. So I got a lot to talk about. Let me start with some background on just who Blaze Taylor is, because I'm gonna be honest, y'all. I didn't know who he was. I had not heard of this guy, this young man, what have you. But Blaze Taylor, everybody. So let me just get set up here. And let me get my banner going. Shout out to everybody coming on. See you guys watching. Don't be shy to say hello. But anyway, and also my TikTokers, what's up to you guys? And of course, all shows dedicated to the late, great John Matt McGrath, our producer, now in the sky. And please subscribe. If you're just watching, just subscribe. So Blaze Taylor, guys, let me start with that. Blaze Taylor is this young man. Some of you all who are college football fans may know who he is. He's still with us, so it's not who he was. But he's a former college football player turned NFL personnel executive, became widely known, more widely than what he was in college, because of this criminal trial involving the death of his girlfriend, Jade Benning, and their unborn child, Ivy. And I use the word girlfriend loosely because it was stated throughout the testimony that those two were not specifically exclusive, but she was pregnant with his unborn child. But he was primarily known before this occurred by running in different football circles as a very highly regarded student athlete and a young football evaluator. Now, Blaze is originally from Waco, Texas, grew up in a football family. His father is Trooper Taylor, a longtime college football coach who has worked at several major programs, including Tennessee, Oklahoma State, Duke, and Texas A&M. And his father's coaching career was what had this major influence over Blaze getting into football and trying to solidify a career as well. But growing up around college football, it absolutely gave him an opportunity to be exposed to the recruiting process, coaching, and the player development. And unlike many young athletes that only see football from the player's perspective, Taylor actually was around this from a familiar standpoint. And so he saw the organizational side and was absolutely able to put two and two together, so to speak, from a football standpoint, because his father had this extensive coaching career. He did play, Blaze himself did play defensive back at Arkansas State University from 2014 until 2017. He was listed as a defensive back and became one of the more decorated players in that program's recent history. So he was definitely no buster, you guys. He put up big numbers on the field as well. He was not highly recruited by the NFL as a prospect because he's only 5'9", 165 pounds, but he did try out, according to his mother's testimony during the trial, testified that he tried out for the New Orleans Saints but did not make the practice roster or any of the rosters that the Saints had. But he did build a reputation through his football acumen, very intelligent, high football IQ, and preparation, leadership, and special teams ability. So when he was at Arkansas State, he was a 4-year player and team captain. Like I told you guys, he played defensive back and became one of their top punt returners. And then he earned a lot of academic recognition. So this guy was smart on the field and off. And he completed both his undergraduate and graduate degrees before his senior season. So very, very intelligent. One of the biggest parts of his life, in fact, for college was the academics, because reports noted that he actually solidified both of these degrees before even finishing his final season of eligibility. So it made him as a standout as an athlete to have such a high presence on the field and off and be able to be such a scholar. He was also recognized as a finalist for major academic athletic awards, including the William V. Campbell Trophy and the Warfield Trophy as well. After he ended his career in college, or I should say his football career there in his scholastics, he did not pursue the traditional football path. He tried to get on with the Saints, as his mom testified. But then he did move forward with football operations and scouting because he had such a comprehensive knowledge of the game and had such a superb academic background. So his resume came highly sought after. He did work as a graduate assistant at Duke University before entering the official NFL scouting world. And his transition was really big because of the defensive schemes he knew about, experience studying opponents, and he grew up around coaches, and not to mention those numbers I told you guys about. So this is where he joined the Tennessee Titans, and this is where our story begins. Had to give you guys some background there, but the Tennessee Titans organization worked in team's personnel department, and they snatched Blake up. He eventually became a pro scout, so he moved up really quickly. And this is a role focused on evaluating NFL players rather than college prospects. When I first heard scout, I was thinking, okay, he goes out and looks at college talent. Nope, this is about the roles that they're playing in the NFL. And it was testified by one of the experts that still works in the NFL that they would actually go out to the next week opponent's previous game and look to see what type of plays were being called during that game. In fact, this young lady that testified, her identity was masked, obscured from the public view because she's still doing this. And so I didn't know this is something they do. I think I told you guys on the Wednesday show with Pink Fanfare that I thought this was illegal because Tom Brady and Bill Belichick was actually disciplined for this Spygate. But I don't know. I'm sure teams have their own ways of doing their research, I guess player research. But anyway, he evaluated players on other NFL teams, studied the upcoming opponents, and assessed potential free agents, and helped prepare those reports for the general manager and personnel departments. So there you have it. In 2021, Blaze moved into pro scouting after previously serving as a scouting assistant. Now, during his time with Tennessee, he was viewed as a young football personnel professional who was building a career in the NFL in the front office world. So after that, he had extensive time, and this is where our story begins with him meeting Jade Bennett. Jade Bennett is the victim in this case that lost her life due to the hands of Blaze Taylor. We no longer say allegedly because he was in the end found guilty by a jury of his peers. And so that's where we start right now. So basically, this is just a case where every day of testimony seemed to add against him, against this other component of the murder itself. It was adding another layer of just what was happening. And if you've been watching court TV, then you know this jury was hearing incredibly emotional evidence, technical evidence, alongside a lot of, different biases, you could call it, but they're not really biases if this is this specific witness's personality and their dealings with either the defendant or the decedent, which is Ms. Benning. So we start here basically that we talk about. This was not a tragic medical emergency. In the very beginning, this is how it started. Jade was dating Blaze. They had met while they were both students. Um, excuse me, while once he actually got out of school, there was another young lady that testified that they met as students. So this was not his first time doing something similar, but this is the first time for the tragic result that was the end. Um, he's accused of intentionally poisoning his pregnant girlfriend, causing her death and the death of the unborn child, which was revealed it was a baby girl going to be named Ivy. And right away, I want to make something clear to you guys. The prosecution has the burden of proof in criminal cases. That's my little legal spiel here. They don't get points for suspicion. They don't get points about if something seems off. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this was an intentional act done by the defendant. The defense doesn't have to prove anything. In fact, Mr. Taylor did not even take the stand. The defendant, he never took the stand. His defense team lined up all of their questionings for each witness. They produced some witnesses, but their witnesses were rebutted on uh, every single testimony they came up for. But I think that that's something people watching from home sometimes forget. Like I always tell people, jurors don't decide whether someone is probably guilty. They decide whether the evidence removes reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt is you and I, the lay person, in our mind, if we felt like something was off or not what it was supposed to be, that is your reasonable mind. It doesn't take much to add to or take away from making that decision. And believe it or not, y'all, that is an incredibly high standard. A lot of people don't realize until you're in the juror's seat or you're in the courtroom working either for the prosecution or the defense, just how high that really is. So it's not about whether or not you see someone on camera doing something. It's not about your visual optics that you can see this. It's about proving the elements according to the law of what defines murder. So in this case, we're not looking at someone on a camera with a gun or a knife or any type of physical force against this person. The prosecution from the beginning said that this weapon was a silent killer and it was poison. And providing a poison case is extraordinarily difficult to provide that type of information for a jury because this evidence is unseen, it's invisible. How was it administered? How did this person get access to it? When did this actually happen? And could there be a better explanation besides, okay, Ms. Benning was poisoned? Every one of those questions has to be answered before a jury is likely to convict. One thing that's become clear throughout this trial is investigators spent an enormous amount of time reconstructing the events minute by minute. They searched phone records, they searched histories, they searched medical records extensively, text messaging, laboratory testing, and witness interviews. And I'm going to tell you guys, a lot of the terms that they use medically, this just lets you know from a defense or prosecution standpoint as an attorney, you have to know things beyond the law. They had to become familiar with medical terminology because this involved the death of someone that was poisoned. So they have to be familiar with how this poisoning occurred, what type of toxicity it had in the body and the victim of Miss Benning, excuse me, the victim's body, Miss Benning's body. And they had to know the technical terms of what poison was actually used, even the chemical breakdown of how lab results come out when these experts came up to testify. And it's almost like putting a 1,000-piece puzzle together. Like every single piece was tiny, but they have to fit just right. It's not enough to have them all in the box. You know they're there, but they have to fit just right to make the final piece, final portrait of all of the pieces. Every single witness provided another tiny fragment in addition to all the other things I told you guys they had to produce. One thing I do appreciate about this trial is that both sides have forced jurors to think critically. The prosecution definitely laid theirs out, and the defense had a lot of comeback. We'll talk about that here shortly. But the prosecution did say and proved that all of those puzzle pieces fitted together perfectly and made one big picture. The defense actually was trying to say that the prosecutor and their investigators were trying to force these pieces. You guys know, as a kid, at least when I was a kid, you have these puzzles and you think some of the pieces go in. The key to it is some of them look like the shape that they're going to go in. Then you realize, no, that's not it. But the more you put a puzzle together, the more the complete image starts to come into view. And so you kind of make sense towards the end of, okay, it's not about whether or not this piece actually fits, but this is not going to even match the portrait that I'm already putting together. I know this piece is not going to go here. So now you have more proof that it won't fit. But as you've watched any witnesses testify, you're going to hear experts, for those of you who are familiar with the court process, and even with emergency medicine and pharmacology, digital forensics, and the investigative procedural law. And I'm going to be honest. At first, it did seem like the Nashville Police Department did not do a good job in securing this crime scene because they didn't think it was a crime scene at first. This call came in as an allergic reaction by Blaze himself. He knew there was no allergic reaction, but that's how the call came in. And so from the moment that Miss Benning entered Vanderbilt Hospital, she was initially treated as an allergic reaction victim. They were running blood, et cetera, et cetera. And that's when they saw that things were coming up that were not matching up with a quote unquote allergic reaction. Let me give a shout out real quick to my producer extraordinaire. What's up, B? Thank you. He says, looky here, the queen of legal. Trying to get there, brother. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for all that you do, B. Shout out to him with these new commercials and promos and stuff. Be on the ones and twos for real. Brian Arndt, Lions fan. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, B. I appreciate you. So listen, back to the toxicology. Unlike DNA, y'all all know these crime sagas. You guys watch CSI and First 48 and all this stuff. It's some fiction there, but there's a lot of truth to that. Because unlike DNA, where jurors often hear a simple conclusion or that we found this DNA, not in this case. This case required jurors to understand complicated medical concepts. And that takes me back to securing this crime scene. It wasn't really treated like one, but even when they got the inkling that it was a crime scene, what did they do? They allowed people that were connected to the victim to run in and out of Miss Benning's apartment, to remove items, to take pictures of items, to video items. I mean, even in one of the pictures, you could see that some of the friends had on shoe covers and gloves because they clearly had watched enough of CSI or what have you to know they did not want to contaminate this evidence. But what was really suspicious, and which we'll get to in a minute, is how even though on the surface the room looked undisturbed, there were a couple of telltale things that were disturbed that were witnessed by Ms. Benning's best friend, Nigella Jackson, who was the sole person that carried the prosecution of this case. Shout out to her being the friend that she is. And I'll get to her comments here in just a second to tell you exactly what she did. Some of the questioning, they even bring in the conditions of the weather, about if it was dark, if it was light. But in a prosecution versus defense, both questions can be true and both answers can be truthful. But when you just leave stuff like that into the jurors, they could be very impressionable and they could come out with different outcomes. So that happened repeatedly throughout the trial. Medical experts that were brought in don't always speak in plain English. That makes it extremely difficult for the jury to understand. Neither do toxicologists. And sometimes jurors actually hear terms they've probably never encountered before. So that puts an enormous amount of pressure on both sides of the table for the attorneys because they have to break these down in what you guys know as layman's terms, because it's their job to actually translate any complicated terms, science terms, scientific terminology into stories that ordinary people can understand. That goes back to our reasonable mind for a moment. But these details are heartbreaking. We only see pieces as a viewer, as the audience watching the trial, but the jurors are right there, and they are removed when there are objections or things that counsel needs to approach the bench for. But the jurors do see everything outside of that. They hear every objection, they see every exhibit, even those that were not shown to the public. They are hearing every sidebar when the counsel does approach, even though it's muted out for the public. And watching highlights on television can sometimes make evidence appear stronger or weaker, depending on those people that are watching compared to the jurors that are actually seeing it up close in person. So, moving on into that, this trial was so overwhelming. They wanted to know who was there, what did they know at the time this crime took place, what did they actually do, and does their behavior make sense from a reasonable person? Was Ms. Benning sick at the time Ms. Jackson saw her last, which was just a few minutes to a couple of hours before? Who was with her when she began feeling sick? And who communicated with her? When was medical help sought from the moment she started feeling bad? And what was said to the 911 operators and before and after the emergency? Those are not random details. Every single detail matters to a juror because they need to take everything into play that is circumstantial and make sure that that circumstantial evidence is actually proven into contextual facts that could be part of the bigger crime. So, if you think about putting all of this side by side, this is what happened for you guys that are not aware. So, Jade Benning is dating Blaze Taylor, but they're dating other people. They don't make any qualms about that. They don't try to hide that. They literally make sure that everyone knows that they're not exclusive. Okay. But that opened the door for the prosecution to say, okay, they're not exclusive. So that means anyone could have done this. Anyone could have done this. Anyone could have done this. Fast forward, because for the sake of time, Blaze reaches out to, he does not want Jade Benning to have this baby. He doesn't really come out directly and say that, but he does kind of say that because he lets her know, if you have this child, I will not have anything to do with you. They had only dated less than 90 days before she became pregnant. And she first confides in her friend, she being Miss Benning, Nigel Jackson, her best friend, who is the key to this case, that she was pregnant. And they talked about via text, and the defense brought this up as well, that she had to basically weed out between a couple of other guys who was actually the father of this child. And they brought that up because they were like, if Mr. Taylor, the defendant, thought that this was not his child, why would he have any type of harm towards Ms. Benning? Because it's not his child. So he wouldn't care one way or another. But witnesses came forward and said, even her mom, Ms. Benning's mom, said that, Ms. Benning was not able to even post on social media anything about this pregnancy or anything because Mr. Taylor did not want this out to the public. He did not want anyone to know anything about her. And in fact, he was still texting his on again, off again girlfriend from college from years ago, even amidst all of this. But that's neither here nor there. The details of the night are what is important, because there was no communication between those two from around November to December. And then on New Year's Eve, Mr. Taylor reaches out to Ms. Benning. She had already told him in a previous conversation, we don't have to keep going back and forth. I know you don't want to be involved, but I'm going to still be a mom no matter what, in those certain words. And so she comes forward, and then he reaches out as if nothing had happened and wants to see her. So they start communicating. They go out on a couple of dates. And then comes the fateful night of February 25th, 2023. And she invites him over to her house and says she's going to make this dish for him, one of her special dishes, which she made chicken pasta, like a fettuccine type dish. And she's talking to her friend, Nigel Jackson. And those two have been friends since they were about 6 years old. So Najee comes over, like, even after Blaze Taylor arrives. She says, hey, basically, I have some extra. You guys, could come over and get some plates. She comes over with her friend Keontae. They pick up their plates. They stay about half an hour. They see Blaze there shuffling through some Uno cards, just kind of to himself. He greets very briefly, not very talkative. They grab their plates and then they leave. And sometime after they left, Miss Benning and Mr. Taylor take a bunch of selfies on her phone. They look like the ideal couple. They're also doing a sip and paint where she's painting pictures and things like that for the baby's room. Mr. Taylor paints this cosmic image that looks like a black hole, and they try to make that into something. The prosecution does use that as, hey, this is what he thought about a baby's room. He wasn't thinking bright and energetic like Miss Benning was, because she was Googling words like positivity and good energy. He painted something that looked like a black hole, like just sucking things up, like literally a cosmic black hole. And so these pictures were laid on the counter. Even after the crime scene was cleared, those pictures were still there. Sometime after they left, they basically said that Jade was drinking a pink lemonade type substance. Mr. Taylor brought over cocaine, guys. Cocaine in a very large amount. They literally said it was so much cocaine that it was the equivalent of, like, I guess, a few 8 balls. So 8 ball, like a pool ball, several of those. Well, you put two and two together. He doused it in her drink. She's still, playing around. They're dancing, they're taking pictures. But within less than 45 seconds of the last picture being taken, she starts to feel sick. And she dials her friend Nigeria Jackson, but she talks to Blaze Taylor, who's still in the room with her, and she says, what did you do to my drink? What did you do? I feel funny. I know my drink tasted weird. What did you do? We'll come out with the second part in just a minute. I got to run a commercial. I'll be right back with you guys. Welcome back to the second half of the Legal Score. I'm your host, Sonja Pearson. Thank you so much for that. Shout out to the McGrath Podcast Network. All right. So when I left you guys in the first half, I was just getting you to the point where Jade realizes something is wrong with her drink. She asked Mr. Taylor, who's in her presence, what did you do to my drink? I know it tasted funny. Let me tell you guys why it tasted funny. So in the testimony, Dr. Aaron Carney, Tennessee's chief medical examiner, was brought in to testify about Jade Benning's blood cocaine concentration and how high it absolutely was. Jade did not realize until she had taken several swallows of this drink of just how potent it was. She's testified, the doctor did, Dr. Carney, that in her history, in her experience as being medical examiner, that the concentration of cocaine found in Miss Benning's body was higher than she had ever personally encountered in an autopsy. She actually even testified that the cause of death was acute cocaine toxicity. She explained that cocaine is one of the drugs capable of causing catastrophic pregnancy complications because it disrupts the blood flow to the fetus. Now, something that I think is really important about this, and something both in attorneys actually emphasized, was the cause of death and the manner of death are not the same. The cause of death answers what killed somebody, and the manner of death answers how it happened: natural, accident, suicide, homicide, undetermined. Earlier in the case, Dr. Carney actually testified that she could determine the cause of death, basically, not the manner of the death based on the autopsy by itself. The prosecution thought that this, surrounding evidence answered that question, but the defense honed in that that distinction was very high, and they honed in on that and highlighted on that repeatedly throughout this case. The state also emphasized that there was no physical evidence suggesting that Ms. Benning was a chronic cocaine user, which was very important because the defense kept trying to bring in her recreational use with marijuana and with mushrooms, and those things were ruled out. There was no identifying information on her cell phone after she confirmed that she was pregnant, except she was negotiating some small distribution deals to some of her friends, but she herself was not specifically partaking of that. She had no nasal damage from showing that she had partaken of cocaine. There was no needle marks, none of the signs on her body that showed any type of long-term abuse. And she also testified that the toxicology findings were most consistent with those of an oral ingestion of cocaine. Now, y'all, nobody freaking drinks cocaine. Everybody knew that. Everybody generally knows that no novice drug user is going to drink or ingest cocaine. And that's big because that fits directly into the prosecution's theory that the cocaine was consumed in a drink. Now, that's the state's theory, not a specific established fact. But this is where the defense came in and pushed back. They challenged the toxicology process. They challenged the chain of custody, which, for those who know a little bit about law, chain of custody is basically documenting every time something was moved, every time some evidence was moved. And they didn't always do a good job of doing that. That's why I told you all earlier, I don't think the city of Nashville, as far as a law enforcement perspective, really took this case on to secure it. And I am not going to be surprised, y'all, if this case goes up for appeal, because not only that, but throughout this entire trial, Judge Dozier, respect to him as a judicial, a jurisprudence and serving as a judge, but he kept interjecting way too much for a judge, considering this was not a bench trial. Bench trials are before the judge, jury trials are before the jurors, and he, like, it was just apparent in some of the comments that he seemed biased. So I just wouldn't be surprised if the defense is already getting ready for this, appeal. They would be filing one regardless, because the defendant has a certain period of time, usually about 30 days from conviction, to file any type of motions to set aside the verdict, whatever, what have you. But this one, I think, just because of how tacky things were done from the law enforcement perspective all the way up to the bench, I just feel like his team is already on it. Shout out to Letitia Quinones Hollis, the lead defense attorney for Mr. Taylor. And they just, and Mr. Faulkner, for the prosecution, they had their work cut out for them. But if you think about it, she says, "What did you put in my drink?" She's on the phone with Najee Jackson, bringing you guys back to that. She has the phone laying down. Najee texts her, "Are you talking to me?" The defense tried to play that like she was talking to Najee, that Najee had done something to her drink. But it really was not, y'all. It was a plea for help. Najee Jackson testified that was the last phone call and last audible conversation that Ms. Benning had, and it was where she asked Blaze to check his hands or his pockets. What have you done? Of course, Mr. Taylor sitting there, they're on the phone for 6 minutes. She hears everything Jade is saying until Jade is no longer responsive. Jade goes into a room and vomits on her comforter. That was later confiscated by Miss Jackson and some of their friends. They removed that from the scene, as well as her stepmom. It was just a lot of moving parts, and friends of the stepmom and friends of the mom that were all involved. They had driven up from Little Rock, Arkansas. They'd driven up everywhere. Like Jade was very well loved, and so people were, wanted to make sure this got done right. Long story short, she that call ends. Miss Jackson is now on her way back to Miss Bennett's apartment. She calls, before she gets there, she calls, patches in Keontae, who brought her over there earlier, because it seemed like Miss Bennett was actually asking for him, perhaps because she's in the room with a male and she felt like those two had just left, and she felt like perhaps Mr. Keontae could actually assist Miss Jackson in helping her. But it was too late, y'all. It was too late, because the way this was testified by Dr. Carney, the amount of cocaine in her body, within 2 minutes, it was a wrap. They said most people go into cardiac arrest, but not Miss Benning. She vomited her body trying to rid this poison, but then everything just started to shut down. She gets to the hospital because Blaze finally calls 911. And she's on life support for 2 weeks. They said when she got there, she never had a heartbeat, despite them trying to resuscitate her. And they finally took her off of life support on her birthday, which was March 6th, a couple of weeks later, her 25th birthday, in fact. And so the baby was already in distress. They could not save the baby. She was 25 weeks pregnant, you guys. So had a lot of baby stuff. They said when they got to the house, when the investigators got there, it smelled like it had been cleaned, but they made it just seem like it was just cleaning up after a dinner, but the food was still on the table. There was on the stove. There were some cookies still there that she'd made, and an empty glass. And none of that was brought in for evidence. And that's why I said they did not do a good job of grabbing evidence, because I think for a while they did not realize this was a crime scene. And so if you think about, Miss Jackson was on the stand. She was the key witness of the prosecution team. And she talked about this, how excited Miss Benning was, like how she talked to her mom every day about this. It was just an overwhelming amount of evidence that showed that she was planning to keep this baby, and she was definitely happy about it. Defense tried to bring up the fact that she'd had an abortion before. But what was critical was Mr. Taylor's former girlfriend came in, and she testified that she too had become pregnant right after meeting Mr. Taylor. And she knew she didn't want to be a mom. She's like 18, 19. So it was her idea to have an abortion. So he was all for that, paid for the abortion and everything. But when they broke up, he continued to communicate with her as a friend, because he'd gotten his on again, off again girlfriend pregnant. And he was looking up on the phone what types of medicines or pills or what have you to give someone to cause them to have an abortion. And he had asked this young lady to even get him a plan B. And she was like, I cannot do that. He was like, well, get me an abortion pill. And she was like, I cannot do that. But he did confide in her that he was looking up what drugs would cause an abortion. And because cocaine causes a rupture of the placenta, it is generally the main drug used when people are wanting to abort a baby without actually getting it medically done. So she comes up, she testifies about that, and that's when it was literally like an ace in the hole, because when the prosecution presented that, it was quiet. It was a different type of quiet in the courtroom. It was a different type of quiet in the courtroom to know that this is something he's done before. This presented a likelihood of him to repeat the same behavior. It also highlights the fact of just how he was familiar with this type of research. And like people don't realize they never found his phone. Let's put that out there. They never found his phone. You know why? Because you knew you had done this crime. But listen here, Apple users, iCloud keeps your storage forever. There are several crimes going on, excuse me, several trials going on right now that iCloud history is the most solid evidence that has been produced. And so getting a new phone, tossing a new phone, if your iCloud address is ever accessible to the government, they're going to get your history. Even if you wipe it from your phone, it doesn't matter. It does not matter. People like to say Apple holds on to your information. Yeah, but with the right warrant and the right person, that information can be accessible. And it was accessible even though the phone was never found. And so there were text messages on there from way back about basically asking about this type of drug. How much cocaine do I give this person? Da, da, da. So in my mind, it makes me think this. He was not trying to kill Miss Benning, but he was trying to kill that baby. He was trying to kill little unborn Ivy. And so all of this evidence comes in really, really big because, like I told you guys, the lady from the Tennessee Titans came in there, and not only did she talk about what their job was, but Miss Johnson is her name. She testified that he did not show up during draft week. Now, this is when this happened. This is the NFL draft, the biggest week for a pro scout. And he did not show up to work. And they reached out to ask where he was. And he said he had to handle a personal matter, but he would be in. You guys go ahead, blah, blah, blah. But he was not there. He was not there. And that also, showed a light on what was going on. So actually, McCall Johnson worked with the Tennessee Titans while Blaze was there as well. And her testimony was not about the night that Jade became ill. It was about conversations that happened earlier. He actually had told her that that he could secretly put drugs into someone's drink and they would never know. And so this young lady was the one that the jurors got a chance to hear up front about just how far back this plan goes. And the fact, if you think about it, that the police never secured the apartment after deciding not to even get a search warrant, y'all. Then, when they released the scene, family members were allowed to enter because police no longer had the legal authority to keep them out. But this evidence that could have been collected is probably no longer available. I told you guys, people said it smelled like it had just been cleaned. Yeah, when you cook, you might wipe something down. But they said it was a different type of clean. Not only that, when Mr. Taylor finally decided to place this 911 call, he was outside. He was outside saying that he was trying to get the address for the 911 operator to dispatch EMT because he supposedly wasn't familiar with where he was. Okay, y'all. He could have taken the glass out and tossed it. No one ever searched the trash. They never even searched the premises outside the apartment. And there was also a surveillance camera that was right outside of Ms. Benning's apartment. No one even introduced evidence from that. I don't know if the camera wasn't working or what, but the apartments look like they're fairly new. They're on Lebanon Road out in Nashville, Tennessee. But a lot of just goofiness, honestly. This is like some type of Sherlock Holmes less half standard research and evidence collection. And so the prosecution was like, you know what? It doesn't even matter what the defense is saying. They said we don't have enough evidence, but we got enough. We got enough because even though you're saying this drink container is missing, we're not even centered on how it was contained. We are centered on that it was ingested in her body. And we have professional medical people to come forward and testify that this is what took her down. They came in and they actually even had them testify what cocaine does to the body within a time frame, things of that nature. And they equated it to poison because of the toxicity level of just how much it was. Now, they play the 911 call, y'all. And when you first listen to the emergency calls, you're hearing people before they know that they're being investigated. So they're thinking, hey, Mr. Taylor's like, I'm going to call this and as an allergic reaction. He's calm. He's never emotional. But prosecutors often say this is when you get the most genuine reaction from people is during a 911 call. The defense attorneys are saying people react differently under stress and panic, which is true, but jurors get a chance to hear that and decide whether or not there was urgency in Mr. Taylor's voice or not. But if you remove the emotion from the equation, how strong is their actual evidence? Then you flip it around. If you remove the science from the equation, how compelling is the human testimony? The truth is, the case depends on both. They like to say in law school, it depends. Everything is, it depends. If you ask me, Sonja, is it going to rain outside? And I see it's cloudy, it's dark, it's been dark all day. I'm still going to tell you it depends because I don't see the first drop of rain. And in a second, the sun could peek through the clouds and now there is no rain. So it's the same thing. State isn't asking jurors to convict based solely on toxicology. They're not asking them to convict Mr. Taylor based on emotional testimony, and there was a lot. They're asking jurors to see one consistent narrative that basically nets together every single witness that they've put on the stand. They want to stitch together all of the testimony into one big quilt. And the defense wants the jury to see separate pieces, like this person's making their thing, this person's making their thing. We are not having a complete picture here, but that's what the defense is supposed to do. Witnesses are done, evidence is in. Now the attorneys have the biggest question of all towards the end. Have they earned the jury's confidence? Because that's what really every criminal trial comes down to. Think about it like this. All lawyers know the law, okay? I've learned that just in studying myself. All of my classmates before a test, we all learn the law. We all have the same definition of what the law is. They don't grade you a lot on whether you can recognize the rule, the law. They grade you on your analysis because if both attorneys, and that's preparing you for practice, if both attorneys come into the courtroom and they both know the exact same law and there's no deviation, it's exactly there. It's like a Bible scripture. That's thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not kill. That's it. There's no room for input. But then you want to make sure that you're more convincing than your opponent. Why should thou not kill? That's your analysis to your current situation because that's part of gaining the jury's confidence. Not which attorney gave the better performance, which one was more persuasive. Not who was most dramatic with their objections or theatrics, because there are always those, but whether 12 individual, reasonably minded people can sit in the courtroom and then leave the courtroom believing that the evidence that they were presented was met or was failed to be met, the highest burden in our justice system overall. So, when you think about all of the evidence, the phone call by itself may not prove everything. Text messages may not prove everything. Medical findings could prove something, but not everything, because it still leaves that small opening that Ms. Benning had this cocaine herself, and Mr. Taylor just happened to be there. She fixed her own drink. He just happened to be there. But then you start to put it all together. A witness statement by itself may not answer every single question, but consistent witness statements do start to piece together the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is what the jurors look at. And they deliberated, y'all, for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I remember I put my YouTube back on it to see just how long. It was so swift. When they came back, said they had reached a verdict, I knew that it was going to look bad because a quick verdict is never, well, I don't want to say never, but it could be possibly never. So this Tennessee did get it right with the prosecution, unlike the Rick Chow case I told y'all about. They went in for murder and that's it. All murder, all first degree murder, all felony murder, just murder, intentional murders. In fact, correction, they only went for first degree murder and that was it. No lesser included offense or any of that. And let me tell you guys real quick because my time is ticking. Lesser included offenses, for those who don't know, is basically there's the big crime of murder, and then when there's other things that are part of that same murder, they just kind of merge under except for another murder. Well, Tennessee was like, you know what? We saw what you did, South Carolina. We're going to make sure we are not having that same mistake here. So this is what we're going to do. And it took the judge almost an hour, Judge Dozier, an hour almost to read the jury instructions. They defined every single thing that a juror could possibly have a question about. They said, we're going to go for felony murder, which is when a homicide, a death, occurs as a result of a felony being committed. Now, most states' common law, a felony murder will merge in when it's a homicide because that's already there. But a felony murder would be if someone robbed a bank and someone got shot and they died. Okay, their intent was to go in there and just rob the bank, not kill anybody. Now you got a felony murder because someone died as a result of you committing this felony, which is the armed robbery. But with this specific case, Tennessee got it right. Now, their police department, I'm sorry, I just, from the beginning, I was like, what is going on? But their prosecution, their state, their district attorney, oh, spot on. We're going for felony murder. Then, if you don't convict on that, we're going for first degree murder, which is the intentional part of it. It's the defendant deliberately caused the death of another with intent, which is the mens rea part of it. And they did commit the act that took the life of another with willful, premeditated, and deliberation. That's first degree murder. That's textbook definition. Shout out to John Marshall, Professor Barker, Dean Barker. That's textbook on that. When you come out of first degree murder, then you go down to second degree, then down to voluntary, then involuntary. They would not bring up anything like depraved heart murder because that's usually when there is a reckless behavior. But you know what? They did give depraved heart murder as an option. Let me go to that real quick. So if it's not willful, deliberate, then it meets second degree murder. If it's not second degree murder, under the rule of provocation, which means Ms. Benning would have had to provoke Mr. Taylor to behave the way he did, it would have been under voluntary manslaughter. However, you would not see this type of charge with a poisoning. Rule of provocation is usually when there's a provoker that your life or someone that's in your proximity's life is in danger and you feel like you are having to remove the provocation, or in the instance if, say, for instance, someone cheated on someone, spouse, and they caught them in the very act, not watching a live recording, they decide to go and unalive them. They have to see them in the very act, to unalive one of the people or both. That's under the rule of provocation. But anyway, that's not applicable here. So then they said, if you don't get second degree murder, which still has the intentional aspect, then we want you to consider voluntary manslaughter. If you don't, voluntary manslaughter is everything without them being able to prove the intent specifically, but the actions of the defendant show that they had an intent. So it's not like, okay, I made up my mind, I'm going to do this, and it's there. It's like, okay, no, you pull the trigger. You did mean to do that because that was your intent. You don't just pull a trigger and not expect a bullet to come out and hit somebody, or if you're standing in front of them. So then you go down to involuntary manslaughter and reckless conduct if they felt like, in depraved heart murder, if they felt like in the conduct of Mr. Taylor being reckless, having a conscious disregard for the person of another, knowing that the likelihood of death would be imminent, would be the reckless or the depraved heart. And so basically each one of those counts, the judge said, if you find on this, then you don't need to go to the other components. But if you can't find on the higher, then you keep going down until you get where you need to be for your conviction. And if none of those meet your conviction standards, then you'll come back with a bill of not guilty. Well, honey, no, ma'am. No, sir. They came back with first degree right off the bat. The fact that Mr. Taylor went, got this cocaine, texted Ms. Benning to set up this date, because that's how he did. It was deliberate, it was intentional. And not only that, y'all, he watched her die. He literally watched her die while she was on the phone with her best friend, Najee Jackson, saying, "What did you put in my drink? I knew my drink tasted funny. You're scaring me." And he repeats, "You're scaring me." So that's just enough there. So Miss Jackson will know on the other end, okay, yes, and he's still in the house. So even though me and my friend Key left earlier with our plates, Mr. Taylor was the only one that could have done this to him, to Miss Benning, excuse me, because he was still there. The jury came back. First degree murder is met, intentional murder. 51 years in the state penitentiary for Tennessee, because life is 51 years. He is 31 years old. He would not come up for parole if they said without parole, but they just went ahead and gave him life until he's 82 years old. But there's a second component of this trial, because on August 2nd, he's going to be going back for the bench part of it, because they did convict him of felony murder as well. And so that is a bench sanctioned punishment, which would just be another life sentence. But you threw your life away for this beautiful young lady and her beautiful soon to be baby girl. And I just condolences for Miss Benning's family and her friends. And shout out to Miss Jackson, because she was the one that, hey, cousin Pam, it's my cousin, just subscribed. Pam lives in Nashville. And so thank you so much for joining me, Pam. Just shameful and doubtful, but just goes to show, when you do things and you know you've done something, you will be found and you will be held accountable by people of your peers. All right, guys, that's all the time I have for today. Thank you so much for the likes, loves, and shares. Make sure you check the replay. And you guys have an amazing Saturday. Catch us tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. for the Sunday Morning Sports Show and shows throughout. Good night.